And now, without further ado, I will invite our next speaker, Mr. Jan Skopeček. He is an economist. He is the deputy chairman of the Czech Parliament, of the lower chamber, and he is interested and he is concerned with public money. So he is the specialist who has things to say which will be interesting for us, especially in the field of investments. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor for me to open your conference. I do appreciate it. Although I have to say that when your rector asked me to come and give some presentation, I was trying to discourage him from that, because I don't consider myself an expert or specialist in investments, and I don't feel properly placed to be the one to give advice to people. I am a macroeconomist, a theoretician. I am active at the Faculty of Economy. But then we sort of struck an agreement, and we decided that might be interesting, because even for investors, as I believe, it is important to have a broader view, more general view. And it seems to me sometimes that some of the specialists who are interested in a particular type of investments oftentimes are too busy to follow the movements of the individual commodities on a daily basis, and they obviously focus on what are the interest rates as decided upon by this or that bank and so on, which is quite normal, but sometimes it takes it is important to have the global perspective. Oftentimes, some of the investors are prone to repeat the erroneous decisions taken in the past and neglecting some crises which are looming, which nevertheless had been here before and which could have been a lesson for us. So it is really important to take a broader view of everything. So I have a couple of slides, and I will try to speak about the possible impact this or that could have on investment and investment decisions. But I will focus on two phenomena in particular. If I prepared my presentation a couple of months ago, I would probably speak about inflation in particular. That would be the key word, and we would speak about all the consequences, about possible solutions, and so on. But the past few weeks made me add the word stagflation, because I think that the risk of stagflation is growing, and we will speak about what we should do about it, what are the instruments which are available, and what the monetary policy could do about it. There are some starting points for me to propose at the beginning to understand everything properly. The current economic development, including the negative phenomena as the high inflation rate or even stagflation, has a number of very profound roots, and there are many phenomena along. Not everything can be put down on the Ukrainian war. It is a crazy, mad thing where people are dying, but it is not the only reason for many negative effects. They are only deepened by the war. We can't put down everything on COVID either, even though obviously it was one of the causes. The extremely eased currency policy, the fiscal expansion, and the growth of indebtedness of a number of Western economies is not something which can only be observed as a consequence of COVID or of the war in Ukraine. It is something that has been there since quite some time. I said that I would like to give you a broader context for everything. We will be speaking about the individual instruments and what's the elementary or the fundamental phenomenon nowadays is the role of the state. When speaking about the expansive monetary policy or the fiscal policy, that was just what I was referring to.
Škrtí nebo co zapříčiňuje
průběh
tempa hrubého domácího produktu, tak je to především růst vstupů, který samozřejmě vidíme z důvodu nějakého rozpadu odběratelsko-dodavatelských řetězců.
This disintegration of buyer-supplier chains as a result, as a consequence of the war in the Ukraine. But it must also be said that a number of problems has been caused by what we were doing before. There is a trend, especially in the Western economies, and this is in the context of the decarbonization. Obviously, it is a noble goal. We all want to enjoy the clean environment, but I think that decarbonization perhaps is pushed at in a somewhat irrational way, and the energy prices had been growing prior to the Ukrainian conflict, and there are these regulations, regulatory measures taken by the states where renewables are imposed on the states to substitute for the traditional sources, but they are expensive and they are also the reason of the instability of the grid, and there must be some standby facilities as a reserve. So there was also the capital which was accumulated in the past years, but many economies had to close the economy in the context of the pandemic, and many sectors were just halted, and the entrepreneurs, the businesses had no reason to invest in enlarging capacities. As to the interest rates, there is a dichotomy in the development between the Czech Republic and the European Central Bank. These are the two central banks which have the biggest impact on us. The Czech National Bank was faster and more radical in trying to cope with the inflation through increasing the interest rates. This will be a phenomenon which will further decrease or undermine the economic growth. Then there are sanctions and restrictions. For the time being, the effect is merely marginal, and I also want to say that I approve of the sanctions against Russia for their behavior, for this mad aggression which they unleashed against Ukraine. I think the sanctions are unprecedented and will cost very dear to Russia. And I think that this is likely to impact Russia decades ahead. But we have to realize that the restriction will also have an impact on us, although we do not see the impact. It's not yet measurable. At the beginning, I said that a couple of weeks ago, I would rather speak about inflation. I'm afraid that even in the Czech economy, the risk of stagflation pressure is increasing. These are the most recent figures of the Czech National Bank. You can see that the expected growth for this year is 1.2. It has been reassessed because the prognoses, as they were formulated before, the World Bank and the IMF had to reassess the estimates as well. What we can see is the high inflation rate. We were not used to such a figure. If we speak about investing as we do today, we can't avoid inflation. And I think that your colleagues will also speak about it. It has a tremendous impact on investing. Such an inflation rate means that people who were used to save money, to make economies in a traditional way, as my parents did, and myself as well, using the standard investment instruments like deposit accounts, securities, the classical form of securities. However, once we are faced with the inflation, this really is a challenge, because if we want to preserve the value of the money which we've of our economies, we have to change the way we invest. There is the technological growth as well, which also has an impact, and there are also sometimes the restrictive measures which are put in place by the governments, and which may also influence the technological development of investment instruments and so on. I think that there have been also these things which had an impact on the inflation rate. I'm a politician, and if I watch the central authorities and the Czech National Bank, for that matter, who are sometimes reluctant to facilitate the access of cryptocurrencies to the Czech Republic, oftentimes I say to myself that they are struggling against something which they had caused themselves, because people simply don't believe the currency authorities or the traditional instruments if they want to cope with inflation, and they just don't believe the state currency, because it is falling victim to the indebtedness of the Western countries. And the central bank cannot further increase the inflation rate, because it would put at stake the economic development of especially the southern flank of the EU. You can see the figures, they are not very encouraging, and they really testify to a huge problem in the form of the inflation and the fast increasing inflation rate, and the economic activity is dropping, and there doesn't seem to be any light at the end of the tunnel. So we should really be speaking about the risk of the stagflation. When talking about inflation, one more phenomenon which also is associated with inflation. Economists and politicians have been motivating people to be prepared, to prepare for the old age, because as a result of the demographic trend, the younger and middle-aged people are no longer able to rely on the pay-as-you-go retirement pension insurance. They cannot expect the same standard of living as the one they've grown accustomed to. So along with the state retirement pension, they should save money to improve the situation. But now people who've been doing that see that the economies, the savings are being eaten away by the inflation. So for the state and for the pension funds, pension companies, they will find it difficult to convince people to save money, to put money aside for the old age. There are investors who come with new methods, new instruments, and this is perhaps a place for them, or a place on the market, a niche in the market which they can use.
Podle mého názoru je způsobena ta dnešní
in your opinion
hrozba a s čím se třeba s čím má řadu podobností, tak já jsem jednoznačně přesvědčen, že
I am convinced that today's inflation is not an accidental phenomenon.
Já jsem skutečně přesvědčen, že dnešní vysokou míru inflace máme kvůli chybě států, kvůli chybě hospodářsko-politických autorit, a to jak na straně centrálních bank, tak na straně veřejného sektoru, respektive vlád. Jsem přesvědčen, že za tu dnešní míru inflace můžeme poděkovat extrémně uvolněné měnové politice v posledních letech, ke které se bohužel předávala i extrémně uvolněná fiskální politika, charakteristická vysokými deficity a nárůstem vládního zadlužení. Samozřejmě k tomu přistupují i nějaké nabídkové šoky. Tady bych znovu zmínil oblast té energetiky. Myslím si, že se opravdu v energetice dělají věci, které nemají s ráciem cokoliv společného a že často energetici to říkají poměrně jasno. Často ta politická reprezentace těmi environmentálními a energetickými politikami jde proti fyzikálním zákonům. V této chvíli, kdy prostě rostou ceny energií, tak je potřeba se podívat, že ty ceny, že na tom růstu cen energie má ta hospodářská politika velký vliv. Jednak tím, že ceny energií jsou velmi státem daňově zatíženy, to znamená, že z těch vysokých cen platíme poměrně vysoké daně, že jsou zatíženy nějakými umělými regulačními nástroji, jako jsou emisní povolenky, které kvůli snaze uspořit CO2 dále zdražují jednotlivé energie. Ale je to i například politika odklonu od jaderné energetiky v Německu, která vede k tomu, že té energie v Evropě bude méně a bude se muset získávat z těch mnohem dražších obnovitelných zdrojů. Další ten fenomén, proč máme tu stagflační hrozbu, vidím v tom, že chybí jasná míra inflace, která by byla pro centrální banky tou červenou linií, přes kterou nechce jít. Nicméně tady se musím zastat České národní banky, že přeci jenom se chová racionálněji než Evropská centrální banka. Když Česká národní banka začala zvedat úrokové sazby, tak jsem na rozdíl od řady jiných politiků tento krok bránil. Říkal jsem, že Česká národní banka nemá příliš mnoho jiných nástrojů, jak tu inflaci zvládnout, a pokud nechce rozbourat to, čemu my ekonomové říkáme inflační očekávání, tak k nárůstu úrokových sazeb přistoupit musela. My ekonomové samozřejmě víme, že to, co dnes dělá Česká národní banka s úroky, se neprojeví v té inflaci druhý den, za týden nebo za měsíc, že ten transmisní mechanismus měnové politiky je dlouhý, že má horizont roku až půl, kdy se může v uvozovkách to dnešní zvýšení úrokových sazeb v té ekonomice plně projevit. Na straně druhé právě proto, abychom si absolutně nerozbourali ta inflační očekávání, která vytváří tu budoucí inflaci, tak ten zásah té centrální banky byl nutný, protože jinak by ekonomické subjekty přestaly důvěřovat tomu, že se vůbec nikdy z těch vysokých čísel inflace nějakým nižším vrátíme a všichni bychom se ta vysoká inflační očekávání dál tlačili sebou, dávali při tvorbě cen, bychom je akceptovali, při dlouhodobých smlouvách bychom v rámci inflačních položek dávali vyšší míru očekávané inflace, čímž bychom v budoucnu tu inflaci dál tlačili nahoru. S tím je spojená, když jsem teď pochválil Českou národní banku, jakkoliv já si třeba myslím, že ten nárůst úrokových sazeb měl být více rozložený, že přece jenom ty nárůsty jsou příliš radikální, ale obecně s tím nárůstem úrokových sazeb v České republice souhlasím, tak vidím ztrátu kredibility zejména na straně Evropské centrální banky, která podle mého názoru ztratila to, co vždycky pro vyspělé ekonomiky, zdravé ekonomiky s nízkou inflací bylo charakteristické, a sice to, že byla oddělena fiskální a měnová politika do dominantní roli se snažila o cenovou stabilitu. Myslím si, že Evropská centrální banka prostě nějaký cíl cenové stability zahodila, respektive obětovala ho právě té fiskální politice a tomu, aby fiskální politika dál mohla tvořit deficity, dál mohla tvořit dluhy a ty dluhy byly financovatelné. V konkrétním případě nynější situace to znamená, že Evropská centrální banka má prostě svázané ruce v tom, aby mohla zvyšovat úrokové sazby, přestože by i vývoj inflace eurozóně potom volal, protože zvýšení těch úrokových sazeb by vedlo k ohrožení financování dluhu, zejména těch států jižního křídla, včetně Itálie, která je jednou z největších ekonomik eurozóny, což by ohrozilo eurozónu jako takovou. Co vlastně ta vysoká inflace znamená pro nějaké investiční rozhodování. Myslím si, že ten investiční sentiment se do určité míry přesunul z akciových titulů na komoditní burzy, plus podle mého názoru bude motivovat k rozvoji takovému tomu modernímu, netradičnímu investování, o kterém asi budete dominantně na dnešní konferenci hovořit. Ten ukrajinský konflikt stimuloval růst cen zemního plynu a ropy, ale také obilí, vzhledem k tomu, že Ukrajina i Rusko jsou, jak se říká, obilnící Evropy nebo i širšího regionu a má to poměrně vysoký podíl i na exportu, což samozřejmě má dopady jak v tom finančním světě, tak já se obávám, že to může mít dopady co se týče nějaké
and that will be reflected in terms of sufficient supply of food to various regions. The investors who made their stake on securities did realize their income. For fiscal policies and for governments and parliaments, the situation is rather complicated because the increase of prices potentially can cause social tensions if we react. Certainly there could be some deficit of the basic commodities and artificial breaking down of price growth. It will block the effect which is given by the immense amount of money present in the economy, and probably that will cause more losses. The situation both for the Czech National Bank and for the government and politicians is complicated by the fact of the high inflation, and investors, I think, don't want to live in the world of high inflation because it is difficult to materialize their incomes. On the one hand, there is this pressure on increasing the interest rate, but it then hits the real economy. As an example, I show a table of state bonds, which causes the increase on the price of financing the state actions. On the other hand, not only does this ties the governments on their hands, but it also risks to suffocate further development, and fighting the inflation will lead to stagflation. The policies of the CNB are also reflected in corporate bonds,
which must be offered at a higher yield. And the Eurozone, the situation in the Eurozone increases the appreciation of the Czech crown, and that's another part of the currency policy. Another consequence, and there are a number of consequences, but we should probably be nearing the end of this speech. So it limits investment activities in terms of property. Mortgages are offered at a higher rate. Regulatory data such as DTI and FTI cause mortgages to be more difficult to obtain for the clients, and the mortgage market will be cooled down. The extreme demand and insufficient supply was caused by the overregulation on the side of the state, and bubbles were created in the market and grew, which could be another possible subject for your conference. The bad policies inflate the bubbles. As I said in my previous phrases, the situation puts fiscal and currency policies in the center of attention, and banks and governments are put into a very difficult situation. There is no panacea for the inflation. I can see here rhetoric saying that whether it concerns food or other commodities, it motivates political representation to say that we will compensate for everything, easing more money, and that will mean putting more money into the economy, thus inflating the bubbles further and causing even higher inflation that can be expected in the future. And to close with one more theme that may be connected to the economic and political life. It's something that I would call deglobalization, which also can be of interest to you, because we start to speak of concentrating or focusing on self-sufficiency instead of globalization. Localization should be employed. I would warn against this. It was bad to be 99% dependent on Russia for gas, and certainly this should be changed. But on the other hand, one must realize that we are one of the most open economies in the world, and our riches is provided for by export. If localization takes place and attenuate international trade, it would fire back on such economies as the Czech one. And that was caused not only by the existing restrictions against Russia now. We could observe that development after the big crisis started by the Lehman Brothers fall. When we look at GDP, we can see that the first big fall was back in 2008. Now the share of international trade it is by more than 10 percentage points lower. And we can see that the economies are withdrawing, and that will lead to another decrease, and it will harm us more than others who are not so much dependent on export. If the international trade decreases further, because a number of incomes really come from the fact that we are included in international trade. So that these are my macroeconomic observations which could be further discussed by others, how to use these thoughts in their investment. Thank you for your lecture. It was very interesting because you in fact brought a big number of reactions in the discussion forum. Let me pick some of the questions. Is it realistic to put the so-called time test on cryptocurrencies? It says that the government said it would regulate cryptocurrencies. What will the next step be? Would there be time testing such as in securities? Well, I am a classical liberal, and I will be against any regulation of cryptocurrencies. Their development is response by people who lost their faith into state currency, which lost a big part of its authority. It was well off when inflation was low. Nowadays, no central bank can provide for low inflation rate. If you saw that there are some objective causes to it, and the central bank takes steps against it, would be another type of business. But now we can see the central banks rather support the over-indebted states, and that led to the technology progress. It would have taken a place anyway, but the situation only speeded it up. I'm not an expert on cryptocurrencies, but I believe that we can find some projects that are really speculative and crooked, in fact. But we can find also, we should warn against the false currencies, but on the other hand, I believe that it should depend on the responsibility of the subject that makes the investment, and the government is not here to lead them by the hand. There are several questions. In the situation that is on now, what do you think of euro? Well, in the long run, or let me put it this way, I did study it, and I believe that at present it wouldn't be beneficial for the Czech Republic to accept euro. I could make several lectures on the topic, and but I say that why should Czech crown be bad, so bad that we should replace it by euro? We have a higher inflation rate than the Eurozone states, but still we can find the appropriate level of prices. And exporters, in fact, ask keep a low exchange rate of crowns because that helps them in their activities. Exporters multiplied their exports during the recent period.
So you can see that, crisis or not, we had record growths. Euro is not advantageous to us because the Czech National Bank can perform the monetary policy for the benefit of the Czech Republic and independently, and they can do that. They can tailor-make the economic policy or the monetary policy to the needs of the Republic. If we were in the Eurozone, we couldn't do anything. The ECB is bound by the duty of preserving the interest rate. It can't increase it because of those over-indebted states in the south. So what the Czech National Bank does now is an autonomous monetary policy, which we could not do if we had euro. We would have to accept the monetary policy which originates from the ECB, and it would not be tailor-made to the needs of the Czech Republic. There are some more questions which are connected to it. Several people ask whether stagflation will not revert or deepen into subflation, or whether there is any positive inflation or whatever. Well, we are not yet in the stagflation. That is just the risk looming. There are pressures leading to stagflation. It will largely depend on the international situation. That will play a major role, but this is difficult to predict. We do not know how long will the war last and what the consequences will be. Will Vladimir Putin close the taps on the energies? He is unpredictable, so we can't try to apprehend or to see what can come next. We might be grossly wrong. Inflation can be solved in a way because whatever growth of prices, whatever growth of prices of energies can be compensated by the government. Yes, it can, but this should be aimed at people who found themselves in a difficult situation, not because of their own wrong doings. So we should not rely overly on the state compensations. We've grown accustomed to it. We only take from the state, but it means dependency. If everything that can occur to us will be compensated for by the government to the detriment of the generations to come, it will mean that we will further spur the inflation. So the economic policy must be very careful. It shouldn't be influenced by populism. The European, the Czech National Bank should not contribute to the inflation and its growth by further deficits. Well, I think that we could spend the rest of the morning with this topic only. So I'm afraid we will have to leave it like that. I will try to answer it by emails. Thank you very much for having joined our conference. I want to thank you for the invitation. I hope that it was not too boring for you. I warned that it is not as practical as seems to be the orientation or the spirit of this conference, but I do hope that it was of some use to you, and it might perhaps trigger some more questions. Each of the topics, each of the points which I just raised would merit a conference or a lecture presentation in itself, but there is not enough time for that. However, whatever questions there are, I will be very glad to answer them by email. Thank you for the invitation once again, and may your conference be successful, and may it generate or prompt people to use some very good investment opportunities. Thank you very much.